Great. Welcome everyone to the first panel of the Patchwork Ethnography webinar. My name is Chika Watanabe. I'm a senior lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Manchester. So our first panel, the topic is familial entanglements. And our first paper is by Kate McClellan, who is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Middle Eastern Cultures at Mississippi State University. And the paper is titled Rethinking Distraction. All right, all yours, Kate.
Thank you very much, Chika. And thank you so much to the organizers of the Patchwork Ethnography webinar and the interpreters for this event. I'm grateful and I'm excited to be taking part in these important conversations, and I'm really looking forward to the next 2 days. So the paper I'm presenting today is a first attempt to unpack how anthropologists think about, talk about, and are shaped by distractions of all sorts. In particular, I want to point to what I see as a disjuncture between how distraction is practiced as something positive during fieldwork and how it is made to be something negative at home, while also recognizing that this distinction gives into the fallacies of the field-home separation. Distractions are felt by everyone, but there's often an unspoken stoicism involved in powering through, staying focused, and getting the job done despite hardship. This is especially the case when the distractions are domestic and involve caregiving, two historically undervalued but highly time-consuming and labor-intensive aspects of life for many people, and in particular for mothers. Though this wasn't always the case, distractions in fieldwork are now typically welcome. They are characterized as productive and full of potential, leading to new avenues of research, new contacts, and different perspectives on one's theoretical and methodological frameworks. Distraction undoubtedly shaped my own fieldwork in Syria and Jordan in myriad ways. Interviews, events, and visits to places that I initially assumed to be dead ends, in fact, produced richer ethnography and new lines of research. As ethnographers, we have been conditioned to think of most everything in the field as usable, as work in one sense or another. Even many domestic or leisure activities undertaken during fieldwork, a trip to the grocery store or hanging out with friends at a coffee shop, are opportunities for producing ethnography and theory. Writing about doing fieldwork with children has also started to become more common, particularly when the experience of being in the field with kids is transformative for one's theory, methodology, or helps anthropology parents consider their projects and their careers in new light. But out of the field, and in particular on campus, distractions of the domestic sort, especially when they are children, are usually viewed as unproductive. They are said to interrupt and abbreviate work, distract from producing deliverables, and are treated as impediments to success in academia. After my son was born in 2016, it was made clear that I would need to work even harder and smarter to keep up with the demands of a tenure-track job, and it was implied that my child would ultimately distract and thus detract from my work, both at the university and in the field. This sentiment was multiplied exponentially by the pandemic. My son, who was 3 years old at the start of the pandemic closures, remained out of school for 8 months, and like many parents, my working spouse and I had no form of childcare, no family, no virtual school during this period. My plans to travel to Jordan were canceled, and writing, data analysis, and online fieldwork from home were slowed considerably. Most free time was devoted to the teaching and service obligations of my job. At the same time, university expectations for research remained the same, with an emphasis on publication counts and other so-called deliverables. This, despite a wealth of evidence showing the unevenness with which the pandemic has affected faculty, and particularly female faculty with caregiving responsibilities. How can we reconcile these opposing ideologies of distraction and reframe childcare as productive and meaningful to both ethnographic work and academic life? Part of the problem is that naming or acknowledging domestic distractions is often confused with excuse making, with trying to qualify why something is not up to snuff, incomplete, or ambiguous. I will take a moment here to demonstrate this by acknowledging some of the distractions I faced while writing this very presentation. I'm currently 39 weeks pregnant, about to give birth to my second child in a few days. I am living in a house not my own so that I can be closer to my preferred hospital and doctor, which is over 2 hours away from where I live. My 4-year-old, who is currently out of school because we are not in our hometown, came down with a violent stomach virus this past weekend, causing days worth of cleaning, fretting, and little time for anything else. There is more, much more that I could say, but I will stop there, as listing these distractions can easily turn into what feels like a litany of complaints. And even naming them out loud, I feel an ingrained sense of shame, particularly because of the privilege I know I have that, when they are put into a wider context, makes these kinds of distractions seem meaningless. But privilege does not cancel out the challenges I'm discussing here, as Emily Yates Stower writes about in her own experiences with academic parenthood. This is one thing about these early years of anthropology mothering. Tremendous precarity and tremendous power are wrapped up together in messy ways. The shame that comes with listing these distractions, but not the distractions of fieldwork, is born from false divisions of home and field, and also in part because distractions of the domestic sort are typically portrayed as negative, as a waste of time. Thus, it's heartening to see the many wonderful articles and other works that pointedly examine the messy ways in which home and work, or home in the field, overlap and transform one another, and then use the patchwork nature of those connections and overlaps to produce new avenues of research, writing, publication, or collaboration. Integrating these narratives and practices into our canon, normalizing, paying attention to, and encouraging them is, I think, an important and necessary way forward for anthropology. Here, again, I am particularly drawn to Emily Yates Stower's notion of anti-hero care, in which the typically masculine bravado, independence, completion, certainty, and heroism that are assumed to be central to ethnographic fieldwork are instead replaced by a pursuit of anthropology, both at home and in the field, that nourishes connections of kinship and embraces ambiguity, failure, and incompletion. Anti-hero care is something that allows distractions, even the mundane domestic distractions of motherhood, to do their own thing and to have a place at the table. This is not to say that the distractions of parenting are not at times frustrating and anxiety-producing. Indeed, the word distract, I was surprised to learn, was also once used as an adjective to mean insane or mad, a distract person or a distract ear. Though I want to be careful to not rehearse old stereotypes about motherhood, womanhood, and madness, I do admit to feeling a type of insanity in having my attention pulled in seemingly infinite directions at once. This has especially been the case this last year during the pandemic, and especially considering the unevenness of experience during the pandemic. Many male academics, already disproportionately in senior faculty positions, have used this year to produce and deliver, while many female academics, and in particular mothers and other caregivers, already disproportionately in junior faculty positions, have spent the year in a juggling act, trying to perform the impossible. The refusal of many administrators to seriously address these discrepancies has meant that the gender gap in academia has widened considerably. There is indeed a madness, a distract feeling that comes from such unequal and unfair outcomes. Thinking through different iterations of distraction also helps to challenge the hegemonic ideals of what we consider to be good hard work that structure how careers are thought to be successful. Being distracted, getting sidetracked, straying from one's goals, or losing focus are all seen as symptoms of not working hard enough. This narrative, though, does not make sense for many of us who are working so hard at so many things. Ostensibly, distraction's opposite is focus. Focus itself is a multi-million-dollar industry with medications, superfoods, supplements, work habits, and life coaching, all promising to increase attention, efficiency, and productivity. One cannot do hard work or produce required deliverables if one is too distracted or not focused enough. But I think this is a somewhat facile and misguided opposition, as being distracted simply means being attracted to something else. It is a displacement, not an erasure of one's focus. An attention to something different that, for myriad reasons, one might feel is more important, more desirable, or more pressing. So rather than see my children or my home or the many domestic, familial, kin-based needs that compete with focused work time as distractions, I'm starting to attempt to see them as different attractions, full of focus and potential and hard work. This past year, there's been an outpouring of articles, posts, conversations, events, and movements like Patchwork Ethnography that have allowed more and more space for those in difficult or precarious positions in the academy to reveal and to begin to shift the tired old presumptions of what field work or simply work is or should be. I join in the chorus of scholars and others who also point to the incompleteness of the pandemic, its lasting long-term effects on careers, families, and relationships. Like field work, the pandemic strives to be complete, contained, and moved on from, but like fieldwork, it cannot be. It is anti-heroic, an ongoing, incomplete, messy, and attention-filled distraction that will, I hope, ultimately shift how anthropology is practiced in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so our next speaker is Bhargavi. She's a PhD research candidate in the anthropology department at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, and she works on state and fluid ecologies in Assam, India. Her paper is titled "The Guilty Daughter Researcher, Doing Ethnography While Staying with Family During COVID in Assam, India." All yours, Bhargavi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chika. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. Hello, everyone. This is a brilliant opportunity, and I'm really looking forward for the next couple of days. I'm rightly here going directly dive into my presentation and probably have better conversations and discussions in the Q&A session later. So I would like to begin by giving a little context of my research and my family and possibly how they overlapped over the course of my fieldwork. My research, okay. All right. My research looks at chor areas in Assam, India. Now, chors are river islands and are extremely unstable. They undergo constant erosion. In Assam, the chors are largely inhabited by Bengali Muslims whose ancestors were encouraged to come during colonial times to increase productivity. However, as more and more entered the dense colonial Assam from East Bengal, the native Assamese people became more worried about losing out their lands and becoming a minority. Today, the chor dwellers still continue to face the brunt of anti-immigrant hatred. The anti-immigrant Assam movement in the late 1970s, spearheaded by the upper caste Hindu Assamese men, also not just exposed the xenophobic nature of the movement, but the Islamophobia circulating in the caste Hindu Assamese households. The illegal Bangladeshi is largely imagined as a Muslim or a Mia, a derogatory term to denote Bengali-speaking Assamese Muslims. The hatred they continue to face was reflected even in the state-led NRC project, wherein people had to show documentary evidence to prove their citizenship. The chor dwellers faced a lot of harassment due to it. So amidst all of these ecological and political crises, my research focuses on how the state gets imagined and experienced by them. This is an ethnographic study, and however disruptive this has been, I conducted my fieldwork from July 2019 to February 2021. I come from an upper caste Hindu Assamese household. Both my parents took part in the anti-immigrant Assam movement and are ardent believers of Assamese nationalism. So there's a strong anti-immigrant sentiments amongst them. My father was a member of the right-wing party BJP before switching to the Assamese Nationalist Party AGP. As with many caste Hindu Assamese households, the mockery and subtle hatred towards Muslims in general and Bengali Muslims in particular is normalized through jokes, myths, and everyday stories. By now, it must be clear that my family's political ideology leans towards the right, and it gave them sleepless nights when I first discussed with them my research project. My parents were outrightly dismissive about my plans of staying in the chores amongst the Muslim chore dwellers. After tumultuous negotiations and discussions, it was decided that I would stay with my grandmother in my ancestral village. My father even moved in with me. So I already began my fieldwork in a mesh of emotions, excitement, anger, and guilt. Guilty for not being enough of a good daughter. I mean, who wants to upset one's parents? While also guilty for not being enough of a good researcher. Did I concede too soon? Will living so far away from my field impact my rapport building process, etc.? On September 2020, 7 months after I had stopped fieldwork due to COVID, I began fieldwork.
Sorry, Bhargavi, but your sound went really quiet suddenly.
Oh, can you hear now?
No, it's a bit faint. It was okay at the beginning.
Is it better now?
No.
I don't know what the issue is. Let me probably.
Hello,
Yes, that's much
is
better.
it better now? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we are doing patchwork even here, I guess.
Yes.
All right. So on September 2020, 7 months after I had stopped fieldwork due to COVID, I began fieldwork again. Around 25 days later, my driver who accompanied me to my field first showed symptoms of COVID, and later the entire household. Except me, everyone had tested positive, including my 95-year-old grandmother and my father. This incident washed me with tremendous guilt. But looking back, I now understand that manifestation of that guilt was a result of all the incidents over the months where I did encounter guilt in some degree. When repeatedly it was underlined that I do have time for research, but no time for family. Or as a caste Hindu, Assamese women, I do not show collective disgust for the other, that I have not been the devoted carer of the family, or how I have shown care and empathy for the wrong people in their eyes. I did feel guilty in some degree. Sarah Ahmed, in her book, borrows from Marx to argue that emotions accumulate over time as a form of affective value. I understand that the guilt when I experienced after my entire family contracted COVID was a manifestation of collective guilt. However, I understand this guilt is political. I am arguing that what I felt was by virtue of my positionality in the social structure, that is, one, being a woman, and two, being an unmarried upper caste Hindu Assamese. Ahmed talks about feelings of structure, meaning that what we feel are related to structural inequities, about how emotions should not be understood as subject-centered, as emotions are not bounded or located in an individual subject, but that the subject arrives into a world where emotions are already circulating in very particular ways. So emotions here are guided by the politics of positionality. Emotions create boundaries and your loyalty to collectives. Hence, how an upper caste Hindu Assamese women must be feeling for certain collectives, that is the family and the Muslim Choruas, are already defined. But the idea of guilt also means the acceptance at certain level, the moral standards defined by these collectives. It meant me accepting to some extent how an unmarried upper caste Hindu Assamese woman ought to behave towards her family, as well as the Muslim other. Claudia Leap says how political guilt involves identification with a collective and as a result, take responsibility and accept punishment. Maybe me taking up caring responsibilities and ultimately halting my fieldwork completely can be seen as a way to take responsibility for my failures to adhere to societal roles and emotional boundaries. My feeling guilt can also be seen as a testimony to giving in to how I should evaluate and feel towards the Muslim other, letting the boundaries of us and them exist. Emotionality is messy. Hence, I understand that when experienced two field sites, that is the home with family and the river islands, I argue that emotions spill into one another. Spilling is involuntary or accidental movement, such that there is a possibility that it can go in different directions. There is an unpredictability attached to it. I understand that my two field sites, with its own politics and social relations, would not just spill sometimes physically. For example, when my father accompanied me to my field in the first few months, or when my participants visited me at times in my village, but also there will be a spilling of emotions, particularly guilt from one world to another that I am more interested in. For example, in the act of eating. My caste Hindu grandmother had strict reservations about me eating in Muslim households, as Muslims were understood to be impure for their consumption of beef, and every time would insist on me getting a purificatory bath. After the initial months, I created an elaborate facade of weekly new narratives of invented roadside restaurant names and the food that I ate in each. The lying, however, did make me feel partly guilty. Post COVID, when I began fieldwork in September, I carried, however, my own food and was more reserved at sharing food. This, my participants would quip in saying, Madam nowadays does not eat with us. I felt guilty then of not eating with them, but I say emotionality is messy because I do realize that a part of me was also escaping from the guilt of lying to my grandmother. The spilling of emotions was more recognized post COVID fieldwork. The Islamophobic discussions in popular media about how Muslims were intentionally bringing in COVID did impact my family's discussions against the Muslim other too. Though I vehemently argued against such notions at the time, but in September 2020, when I resumed my fieldwork and I took the ferry to reach the islands as usual, I was immediately scared and disgusted to see this young boy licking the rim of the boat. I became deeply troubled with newer unpredictable fractures coming up in my ethics, as not just as an anthropologist, but as a person, making me reflect if I was a terrible being, encouraging the very politics of othering that I was trying to be critical about. But the fascinating thing about spilling is the unpredictability, allowing the existence of newer possibilities. One does not know where emotions can go, get stuck, and reveal newer corners. Hence, after all the messiness of emotions, I still go on to explore the importance of the figure of the vulnerable researcher. The figure of the vulnerable researcher lets the fractures open and works around the emotion, not escape or master it. Anthropologists have argued how new ways of thinking and understanding are rooted in emotion. Only a vulnerable researcher opens up possibilities to find moments of surprise and shock, to not just understand the topic better, but to constantly review methods and ethics of fieldwork. I ask, how can vulnerability be used as a methodology for a researcher? For a life world where the researcher dives in, that world is messy, where concepts, boundaries, values, identities overlap, clash, spill, and not defined in neat categories. And I understand that possibly only the figure of a vulnerable researcher brings him, her, they, as Ahmed says, closer to that world. Finally, I did feel guilty in the process of writing this about my family. Almost like I'm trading off numerous dining table family discussions, maybe intimate family opinions and secrets in front of complete strangers. So, why do I still do it? For more fractures and possibilities to open up? When I let my stories of guilt spill here today, with the prospect that it will get stuck to newer corners, I'm looking for newer fractures and possibilities of making sense of the world. of methods of fieldwork and anthropology better. For as Kant says, to know something is always to spill over the concept. Hence, maybe concepts of emotions, guilt, fieldwork, anthropology will gain fresh meanings and discussions when I let my guilt from the two field sites spill into now a third space. This, right here, with newer participants, its own politics and relations. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me.
Great. Thank you so much, Bhargavi. Great. Thank you. So next we have Melinda Gonzalez. It's a doctoral researcher in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University. And the paper is titled Methods of Motherhood, Scholarship at the Borderlands of Student and Mother. Over to you.
Good morning, thank you and welcome. I actually finished at LSU this spring, so I will be a postdoctoral fellow starting in the fall at Rutgers University. So my name is Melinda Gonzalez. I am a Puerto Rican woman. Currently, I am wearing a yellow scarf with white and red and glasses. I have brown hair and tan skin. So I also posted a link in the chat with the paper presentation and as well as the blog post that I will be referencing in the presentation. So you can find that at melindagonzalezphd.com/patchwork ethnography. So I want to thank the Patchwork Ethnography organizers for inviting me to talk about my work and how I brought together various anthropological methods to create what I'm calling a methods of motherhood. Now, given the short amount of time for this presentation, of just 10 minutes, I want to, presentation here. I just want to direct you to a blog that I wrote in Anthrodendum in 2019. With a similar title. So in this blog post, I delve further into my intersectional experiences of motherhood, trauma, and precarity amongst graduate students. But for now, I would like to focus just on what I hope to solidify as a method as I continue my scholarship. When I started thinking about what a method of motherhood might be, I was struck by Gloria Anzaldua's Herida Abierta, an open wound, in her canonical work, Borderlands. In this piece, the wound is a physical border between Mexico and the United States, but also a wound that is lived and felt by anyone who inhabits two spaces simultaneously and yet never fully. I then started thinking through Anzaldua's work alongside W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness. That is, the constant inner war of how one perceives himself and how the world perceives you. I found home in considerations of double consciousness as a first-generation graduate student and a single mother. As an Afro-Indigenous scholar, I had already taken an intuitive and decolonial approach to the development of my proposal sorry, I lost my place, and research questions, but not so much my ethnographic field work methods. As I tried to unsuccessfully fit my life into my field work, while I had little funding and faced constant housing insecurity, I recognized that I wasn't engaging in intuitive practices. Rather, I was trying to uphold long-standing anthropological traditions that, let's be honest, were built for white men with money and family support who were not raising children by themselves. Why was I pushing myself to follow this 12-month model of super immersive fieldwork as if though I did not have jobs? Yes, multiple jobs and a child. Attempting to do so was literally making me sick. A few months into my fieldwork, as I faced numerous cases of housing discrimination in my field sites by landlords or real estate agents that wouldn't rent to single mothers, I shifted. Instead of trying to fit my life into the field work, I would fit the field work into my life. Moreover, I would center my role as a mother and as a primary marker for how I would conduct my fieldwork. Now, I know that maybe some of you are thinking that this is, quote, a little backwards, unquote. Am I, a woman, suggesting that we as mothers center our children to the detriment of our careers? Is that not what the whole feminist movement was about, our careers? No, you see, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we need to stop pretending that we aren't mothers, especially for someone like me, a racialized woman who was raised in poverty, who did not have adequate funding, who was raising a child as a neurodiverse person completely and utterly by myself. So yes, under all of those circumstances, I had to center my child's needs, their wants, their desires, their feelings, their tantrums. My fieldwork had to happen around them because while I could take a break or a semester off or even quit my entire dissertation, I couldn't just put my child and their development and their needs on hold. Now, I wish I had time to go deeper into the many challenges that I faced as I navigated being a mother doing multi-sided fieldwork with a child, but I really want to focus on what this method could be. It was hard. Honestly, at times, I was sure that I was harming myself. Doing this really required a few things for myself and my child. First, how do we set ourselves up to be able to navigate these two conflicting roles? Because they are conflicting roles. The first thing I recommend for anyone doing fieldwork, especially about disasters or difficult things, get a therapist. Now, when I was doing fieldwork between 2017 and 2019, telecommute therapy was not the wave. Luckily, I had a friend who was a therapist who provided me with super low cost and sometimes pro bono therapy while I was doing fieldwork. This is super essential, especially for solo parents. Then, of course, if at all possible, call on your people. You need someone to babysit or at least have some affordable aftercare. I mean, these things were essential for me because I am poor. Another thing, have real conversations with your child about what it means to have to do field work and what the expectations are. Then make time, minimally a day, where you don't do any field work at all. And it's just mommy and kiddo time. Going to Friday night movies was one of our favorites. These things may seem basic, but it took me months to figure it out. Now, in practice, engaging in a method of motherhood meant reconfiguring my entire fieldwork design. I, unlike my colleagues, cannot take an entire 12 months out of life as usual. I was fearful that maybe my fieldwork would be viewed as deficient or not enough or not real anthropology, but that was just the colonialism in my head. Ignore those voices. As the title of this webinar suggests, I began to patch different methods together. I still engaged in multi-sided field work, of course, and engaged in participant observation, but I did it my way. For starters, I incorporated digital ethnography on social networking sites as a primary method of fieldwork. Now, this was pre-COVID, where this is still a bit innovative. I know in the midst of COVID, a lot of us have engaged in a ton of digital ethnography. But at this time, right, social networking sites weren't not often viewed as actually a primary field site, right? Maybe something in some parts of anthropology, we could do various forms of, ethnography in virtual worlds, but there really was very little information on how to do digital ethnography, particularly on social networking sites. So because social media was also a very important element in my field work, I focused particularly on Facebook. Facebook provides, quote, fast and low cost access to pre-existing diasporas and other communities, unquote, while facilitating and encouraging activism and crowdsourcing. Furthermore, ethnography on Facebook permits the ethnographer to overcome a number of structural barriers inherent to fieldwork, namely geographic constraints, travel funding constraints, and time to travel constraints. Second, instead of spending 6 months in one site and the other, as my original project design suggested, I split my time between sites through shorter, more frequent trips, which did not disrupt my child's academic program. I also engaged in high intensity weekend fieldwork, but not every weekend, and fieldwork during school hours. While I was originally concerned that this would be detrimental to my project design, it actually served to enrich in the project while simultaneously providing greater and deliberate focus when I was doing fieldwork. With these changes, the project expanded and provided a more in-depth examination of circulatory migration and connections amongst my interlocutors across sites, revealing that there were that most were consistently engaged in circulatory migration and exchanges with each other that I likely would have had missed with a different design. When it came to conducting interviews, I got innovative. Interviews happened via in-person, on Facebook Messenger, via WhatsApp, on Instagram, and via telephone. I shared calls from my research on social media as well. This casts a wider net than it would have had I just been field site specific. I also used an online survey through Qualtrics, and because I was studying the role of poetry and art in community organizing, I incorporate multimodal and discourse analysis as part of my study. By the end of my project, I had actually conducted over 20 months of field work across 3 sites and over 60 interviews. I probably have enough data to write 3 dissertations, but luckily I had to write just one, which I defended this spring. Obviously, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was faced with the question of how to do it all. Remote school for my child, write the dissertation, apply for a job in the most difficult market over the past decade. While I defended my dissertation back in February and submitted it by April, I'm still trying to figure out how I did it all. The real answer is I barely slept. I neglected my physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, and I'm still trying to rest and recover and make sense of it. As I look forward to beginning my postdoctoral fellowship this fall, I, like many mothers, am still trying to decipher how to navigate and juggle these multiple roles that we inhabit. So here's to starting the conversation. How do we support academic mothers? How do we expand anthropology in order to make room for all of us at the margins, at multiple margins? I have many ideas, but I want to hear yours. Needless to say, it's time to make space for families in the academy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure that you're all buzzing with questions at this point and comments. So feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we will answer them at the end of the next paper. And also, I see that a lot of people are putting wonderful comments in the chat. But I realize that for attendees, the chat box is not visible. So if you want to put any of the praises, the wonderful praises for the papers that you're putting on the chat in the Q&A box, then if I press on answered, then it will show up to everyone. So you can see, you can communicate with each other in that way. I hope that made sense. Great. All right, so next we have Megan Moody, Associate Professor of Anthropology at University of California, Santa Cruz. And the paper is called The Creativity of Constraint. All yours, Megan.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm coming to you from Santa Cruz, where I live and work on the traditional unceded lands of the Yupi tribe of the Awaswas Nation, today represented by the Amamutsan tribal band, who are the descendants of the people taken into missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista. I am a white woman with curly dark hair and tortoiseshell glasses. It's February 12th, 2017, 2 weeks before my third surgery in 5 years. My hip pops and snaps in weird directions all the time. I live reclined, glued to the heating pad, housebound. My son, I'll call him T, is 6. He climbs up on the couch with me. Him, I'm so sorry your hip is broken, Mama. Me, I know, Bug, me too. But there's a really good chance. Him, not 100%, but maybe 99.9% chance. Me, well, more like 80%. He smiles. Him, 80% means 20%, like not so good. Me, yes, but 80% is also a very big chance that I'll be a lot more normal and we'll go hiking every weekend. Him, I know. Me, we just have to be prepared for the reality and we can't get brokenhearted. Things might not change. Him, but they might. Me, they might. I think they will. And now, T won't leave me alone. He wants to be with me all the time. He's timing an 8-minute quick write for me, his concession to my job, my compulsive need to document, counting the minutes out with his new analog Casio watch. He is learning to tell time. For a week, he wears the analog watch on his left wrist and a digital one on his right, so he can check himself, make sure he's reading the little hand and the big hand correctly. Now he doesn't need the digital support anymore. He confidently watches the second hand go around and tells me every 60 seconds that a minute has passed. Him, wow, you already flipped to the next page and you write it a lot. Like most ethnographic vignettes, this scene with my son is packed with layers of meaning, a diorama of a much bigger phenomenon that I've come to think of as the creativity of constraint. I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean. When I was 33 years old, in 2010, I gave birth to a son. Nothing about that is particularly uncommon, except that during the pregnancy and with increasing intensity after the delivery, I experienced an alarming pain on the left side of my abdomen that simply never went away. This turned out to be a hip injury. The hip injury turned out to be a sign that I was carrying a secret in my genes, a mystery that would only be cracked with motherhood, a genetic connective tissue disorder known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome turned out to be a convincing explanation for many of the neurological challenges I was facing on a daily basis, from walking to more recently speaking, as my son grew and thrived, and as I worked towards and received tenure at a research university. By the time my son and I were throwing around percentages and he was timing my creative writing blasts, I had been largely housebound for a year. Trips to India, where I had worked for more than a decade, were out of the question. I asked myself and the people around me, with growing desperation and no small dose of internalized ableism, what is an anthropologist who cannot travel? No one could really answer. In the throes of a global pandemic that saw many people sheltering in place, this does perhaps not seem like such a dramatic state of affairs, but at the time, as a housebound ethnographer, I was coming face to face with the great internalized methodological myth of our field, no matter how reflexive and politically engaged one's training is purported to be. And it was uncomfortable. Here's the myth. The anthropologist is a lone, able-bodied traveler who sets out on a journey that will not require him to call home for at least a year. She will miss no one, and neither will they register her loss. After this time out of time, during which, like an intrepid explorer, they follow every lead, visit every site, foster every possible connection, they will return to some base. Sustenance and shelter will somehow materialize. Then our adventurer will be transformed magically into a lone genius, perhaps dwelling in a cave. He will sit in his knowledge den and think important thoughts about all he has seen and heard, but his thoughts will be utterly novel and original, emanating entirely from his natural gifts. She will emerge with a properly footnoted manuscript within the year. Our anthropologist will again travel around the world presenting these important thoughts. People will applaud. He will never be tired, or jet lagged, or upset, or disabled, or so desperately needed by his 6-year-old that the minutes will be ticked off one by one as he tries to think or write a coherent thought. The fact that there are few anthropologists who fit this description mattered little to my own sense of failure in the face of the growing constraints of motherhood and my unruly body. A few weeks after the scene I just described with T, I was recovering from hip surgery number 3. It was slow and painful. I had suffered acute nerve damage. The future was extremely uncertain. My bestie from graduate school sent me a book. The book was called Frida's Bed by Slavenka Drakulic. A novel, it imagines the era in which recovering from one of the more than 36 surgeries that would punctuate her life, the artist Frida Kahlo began to paint in bed. Small canvases, her plaster corsets, later her prosthetics. To be honest, I'd never paid much attention to Frida's life. I love her boldness and her use of color. What feminist doesn't love her unapologetic stare down with history? But I sort of assumed that the coffee mugs and mouse pads had said all they needed to be said about Kahlo and her art. This was a different Kahlo as Crip, a sister comrade making it through the day, as I was, on a combination of opioids and generalized animus, with a dash of hope now and again. A quick internet search brought up several different images of Frida at work in bed, painting her most famous images, iconic self-portraits that I have come to think of as altars, channeling the power of radical transfiguration. This is not just turning lemons into lemonade, making the best of a bad situation, or celebrating the gift of one's illness, all the bootstrap garbage peddled to those with chronic illness. This is the alchemical process that births all creativity, not despite our constraints, but because of them. Anthropologists, as much as philosophers or physicists, partake of Romanticism's sacred individual, a self elevated out of the communal world of craft and commonality, a geometry of the mind that includes linear perspective and its aesthetic, scientific, and psychological concomitants of abstraction, detachment, and singularity. Of course, this is something we've been trying to challenge in recent decades with the embrace of the notion that all knowledge is situated knowledge, and with a much deeper sense that we are not, in fact, producing new knowledge, but often engaging with communities, our own and others, for whom this knowledge is rooted, shared, recognized as truth. In other words, anything but new. But I suspect that many people interested in the idea of patchwork ethnography have also felt the ongoing power of this legacy by falling into its breach and fearing, for whatever reason, that they were not going to produce work that was sufficiently original, either because they doubted their own ability to say something new or because their research didn't go far enough, whether they meant geographically or intellectually. My time as a housebound ethnographer has helped me question the feeling of failure by drawing attention to the necessity of creativity in all intellectual aesthetic work. Ironically, the science of creativity has been showing for decades that the lone genius is nothing but the plotline for the Grail quest and has little to do with how creative work actually happens. Biography shows us that most of the historical figures held up as geniuses, from Michelangelo to Bach to Einstein, were deeply ensconced in the traditions and broader discussions of their particular social historical moments, not to mention benefiting from all kinds of material patronage that influenced their production. In a 1995 critique of the lone genius myth based on their studies in humanistic psychology, Alfonso Montori and Ronald Purser argue that Western intellectual traditions have, quote, an excessively intrapsychic understanding of creativity, informed by the reductionism that lies at the root of methodological individualism. The lone genius view posits an irreconcilable dichotomy or imaginary opposition between self and environment, creativity and conformity. The environment and its influences are in fact viewed as potentially dangerous for the creative individual. More to the point, the creative individual is profoundly decontextualized, and given this opposition between creativity and conformity, there's no effort made to make the context itself more conducive to creativity. In the 8 minutes carefully counted out by my son in 2017, I was able to preserve a moment, a point of contact, the lilt and careen of his 6-year-old syntax as it encountered my own more adult voice. I gave myself the space to write about it, if just for those 8 minutes, as if it were as important as the questions of legal identities and subaltern citizenship I pursued at an earlier moment in my scholarly career. When I was rereading journals from that period in preparation for this talk in the book I'm currently writing, the story jumped out at me from the page. I had forgotten about the dual watches. I had forgotten that my son used to watch me write. And now that moment, with all its sweetness and difficulty and uncertainty, has been transfigured into something else. It was the seed of creativity. I am increasingly unable to practice an anthropology that does not center the role of creativity in our work, that does not face and embrace its art, artifice, artisanship, artfulness head on. I think this is because when I work under the sign of an artful ethnography, my guiding image is not the thinker man in the cave, but Frida Kahlo, in bed, brush in hand. It is the sign of a more capacious field built on values of interdependence and care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These were all really, really powerful papers. Thank you for that. So I think, so we're going to move to the Q&A. So I see that some people have been raising their hands, but as attendees, you can't speak. So if you have a question that's related to the papers or a positive comment, please put it in the Q&A box, chat box. And if you have a comment just for the panelists or a technical question, you can put it in the chat box. Hopefully that's not too, if it's confusing, just pop us a question in whatever space you can see. So I'm going to we have questions coming in and we have about 20 minutes. So I'll read out a question and we'll see if anybody from the panelists want to answer. You can raise your hand or I might call on you if it seems to fit you. And there will be a spotlight on you alongside the ASL interpreter. So we had a question very early on from someone, Anna Horn. And they said, I'm a PhD student planning ethnographic fieldwork in South Africa. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and I'm also currently pregnant with our second child. In the panel thus far, it's clear that patchwork ethnography as feminist approach as it takes into account the role of gender, mothers in particular, it's clear, but can the panelists discuss patchwork ethnography as an intersectional approach including decolonization and anti-racism. I feel like perhaps Melinda got at this in the presentation. Do you want to try to answer that?
Sure. I think that these are still sort of things that I'm thinking through, what it means to engage in a decolonial anthropology, right? So we started with Faye Harrison, kind of canonical text, thinking through what it means to decolonize anthropology. Also for me, what it meant to be a racialized person in the field, and then a single mother, and then someone who comes from poverty. I think the type of field work that I was able to do was very much impacted, right, by the fact that I didn't have family money in order to rely on to take time off. I adjuncted at 4 colleges while I was working on my fieldwork and my dissertation. And so, I think that anthropology is still contending what anti-racism might mean, right, as a discipline that has its foundation on engaging in colonial and racist practices, right? So for me, I look a lot at the work of people like Sean Harris, Linda Tuhui Smith, and thinking through what are Indigenous approaches to anthropology, thinking about knowledge production, and also writing ourselves into the field too, right? I think these are just sort of like starter points. And I think my brain has paused there. So I'll pass it over to another panelist.
Does anybody else want to chip in on this question about intersectionality?
Hi, can I go, Chika?
Yes, of course.
I just have a comment, maybe an observation. I don't think I have like a definitive answer to this, because by now I think we have understood that it's, I think definitive things should be avoided, because absolutism during ethnography is the last thing on our heads after all the papers. So about intersectional ethnography, I don't think, I mean, feminism in itself has to be intersectional, and ethnography in that sense cannot simply be talking about only the challenges that we face in terms of our gender, but also in terms of the race, in terms of the ethnicity, in terms of the religion, and of course the age groups that we belong to. And when we are placed into our into our field work, into our different field sites, and that can be very well your virtual world. All these identities, all these positionalities will come around as a messy combine. And I think that's very important to know about. I also feel that sometimes they might not be a challenge. Sometimes they can also be an opportunity. For example, with me, the fact that I belong to an upper caste Hindu Assamese person, I mean, a context and a background, really sort of also gave me an edge sometimes, because in terms of power relations with my participants, I was actually in a better power position, you know. So yes, sometimes it's going to be an opportunity, not always a challenge, but yes, intersectional ethnography, I mean, is something that we cannot escape from. It's always going to be part of it. Yeah.
Great. Actually, Bhargavi, maybe we can stay with you if that's okay. There's a question. There are a few questions for you. I'll just read out one of them from Saranya Nayak. It says, "Love your presentation, Bhargavi, and very relatable. My question is, did you ever feel that your family's reservations about your work or the restrictions of the pandemic forced you to think of new methods or perspectives that are ultimately a benefit to your research?"
Right. Thank you, Sharanya. Thank you for that question. I hope I could sort of ignite some sort of food for thought there. I mean, I cannot give a definitive yes, because the fact that my family went through COVID, and I still feel that it was probably because of me going into fieldwork. That was a trauma, and I actually went into therapy. So to process that all and then to come across a new perspective on methodology, I think it's a little early for that. However, this entire fieldwork experience in terms of probably being inside, being with my family, as well as being in a pandemic, kind of put in different ways of looking into anthropology and fieldwork. I mean, I'm starting to think about really how can vulnerability of a researcher, how can opening up of a researcher can be effectively used as a methodology in my fieldwork, in anthropology. You know, I mean, what is vulnerable? What is a vulnerable researcher? Who is a vulnerable researcher? How can vulnerability be probably, engendered so that it can be used as a effective methodology, particularly in today's times, when there are limitations to putting ourselves on how traditional ethnographies have been. So yes, maybe on that line, but not too much into new perspectives, as you can put it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. This seems to be a general question that anybody can answer. It's an anonymous person. It says, thank you for all your thoughts. Some of the conversation has focused on motherhood and parenting, but I'm wondering where space can be made to think about caregiving beyond nuclear families. How do we as anthropologists combat not just issues of gender and parenting, but caregiving more broadly for parents, grandparents, sick family members, our sick selves, and so on? Does anybody want to take that?
I'll just say something very quick, which is it's an excellent question, and I think the part of the answer, at least, is just to continue to have conversations like this and to continue to weave into our work and our outputs these kinds of questions, these kinds of demands, that we actually take time to think through these questions of caregiving in a broad sense, and caregiving of all sorts. And I'm also, as someone who works on the topic of care in the Middle East, I'm also, really inspired by a lot of the kind of larger theoretical questions that are coming out about what care is, what it can do, how to conceptualize it. So I think trying to think with those theories as well, to address some of these questions, which are sometimes, unfortunately, kind of de-theorized, right, are seen as something that exists outside of theory or outside of our work, is an important approach as well.
Can I just chime in and say, so this is so important. I think it's really essential. And if the pandemic moment has shown us anything, it is precisely that care is diffuse, and that many of us are ensconced in relations of care that are not just for children, or even elders or biokin. My chronic illness community needs my tending as well, right? And many of us are deeply attached to our political work and our communities, and all of that needs attention. I think there's always a balance, though, because there's this way in which, if we don't talk about motherhood, it can also get swept out with a kind of masking of gender neutral language. And I'm thinking here about things I did a review for my university about the differential impact research. And if anyone's interested, we developed a big bibliography on this that I'm super happy to share. And it actually didn't start with the pandemic, but we know that when you start calling leave parental leave, which has all these great efforts to be more inclusive behind it, you can also start masking ways in which men, fathers tend to use these leaves to publish books and do research, which is not how they're used by female feminized primary caregivers. And so I always want to do both, right? I always want to have both. And I always do want to make sure that we do say mother in public and make sure that, we're keeping it in sight. But it's a super important point.
We have a methodological question, I suppose, from an anonymous attendee. They ask, I agree with Dr. Gonzalez's comments about digital ethnography. I'd love to hear about tips and suggestions about how to go about doing it. How do you collect data? How do you keep data? How do you analyze it? How do you consider ethics in digital ethnography? From Dr. Gonzalez or any of the panelists, if you have any experience doing it, at least a little bit.
So, a lot of the times, one of the things that I notice is that people have this conception that digital ethnography is more amorphous than fieldwork, right? Our traditional kind of insight fieldwork, right? But it's in similar ways, right? When you go to the field, you create constraints around where you're going to be and who you're going to talk to. And obviously also your field, your research question positions you in sort of a particular way. So when you do digital ethnography, you have to do those same kinds of things, right? You pick so for me, I chose Facebook as my social networking site. I did do some digging on Instagram and on Twitter, but primarily I chose Facebook. And then my dissertation research was on post-Hurricane Maria community organizing through Poetic Spaces. So I then once again focused on what kinds of sites I was looking at, right? So I was, for example, looking at Facebook groups that had to do with Hurricane Maria, that I knew had specific kinds of poets in it. And then I searched specific hashtags. So there were hashtags like Poets for Puerto Rico, hashtag Hurricane Maria, hashtag, Our Power Puerto Rico, right? So there were very specific hashtags that I used as well. Digital ethnography. So I actually wrote an article on digital organizing that I can look up and link in the chat in the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters. So with digital ethnography, it can become very overwhelming, right? Because we also have to think through, the fact that sometimes a hashtag will reference the opposite of what you think it is, right? So we see this with, for example, Black Lives Matter, right? Where someone might go hashtag Black Lives Matter, but they're really referencing kind of an all lives matter narrative. So I think digital space has such rich data, and I think it's also one of the ways that we can think through like decolonizing, creating accessible anthropology, what it means that Megan mentioned, right? Like doing fieldwork from the home, right? Like digital space has altered completely the way that human beings connect, interact, the social meanings that we ascribe, and also digital space influences physical space, right? So for example, there were times when I did field work where people would get into arguments on Facebook and it would completely alter the makeup of a poetry open mic night, right? And change the audience. So, but at the same time, you have to create constraints, right, around how you do your field work, what websites you choose, what hashtags you follow. A great tool for collecting Twitter data is MaxQDA. They have in their Max QDA, it's great for data analysis, has various things that you can do. You can collect web pages, you can collect Facebook pages, you can collect Twitter tweets. And then, also one of the things that I found very interesting in my fieldwork was how community organizers were very happy to have Facebook so that they can disseminate information about what was happening after Hurricane Maria. At this time, Facebook didn't have all of this like disaster aid stuff that was directly attached to it yet. This happened after Hurricane Maria, I think because of the impact of Hurricane Maria. But also Facebook was overwhelming for interlocutors as well, right? So I think there's a lot that we can do that is very rich in social media. And I'm very excited to like look into things like Clubhouse and other kinds of social media that are creating forms of like inclusion and exclusion, right? And how they connect people and sites. But absolutely create the same kinds of constraints that you would create if you were in sort of a regular field site as well.
Great, wonderful. We have a question from Anna, who's actually one of the other panelists, but says, thanks for the great presentations. This thought was sparked by Melinda's paper, but I would love to hear from all panelists or any panelists. While universities and colleagues may be suspicious of our familial entanglements, I have found that research participants in the field often embrace them. Being a mother made me seem more human, and having a cute kid along for the fieldwork ride regularly opened avenues for relationships that were warm and trusting. Have you found your familial entanglements were also helpful for your research at times?
Okay. Yeah, I think such a brilliant question, because this I couldn't say in my main presentation, but I know I bashed my family a lot. And I guess so, because when you are in a familial setting and somehow it's your familial relations, connections also slip into your field sites, and when that happens, obviously there are going to be newer relations, newer benefits that a researcher will definitely get. I know when my father, when he accompanied me to my field site during the first few months, for me as a researcher, I think it wasn't very advantageous, or I would see it not as very advantageous, because I was more seen as a daughter and not as an independent researcher. And they would be very, very concerned about the fact when my father would not accompany me, asking me, why am I here today? So it actually brought in questions about if I'm able to do research on my own, or even like they did not understand the purpose of my visiting the field on days when he wasn't accompanying me. However, I realized while I would have discussions with my father, who continues to be having political ideologies very different from mine, his certain opinions, his certain would change or had changed, particularly towards the Bengali Muslims when he was visiting with me to these river islands, because he would be sitting with them, talking to them, and he would realize that they have a lot of commonalities. Probably he realized that there are stories that both he knows, and even my research participants. And I saw my father literally changing in terms of the opinions that he would hold about the Bengali Muslims, because of such intimate exchanges, which were really limited before, So I don't know how it was advantageous for me right now. I can't point out that. But in terms of a happy thing that happened, definitely this that I would like to point out.
Great, wonderful. We are at the end of the panel, but maybe we can steal a 1 minute from the break, just because there are so many questions. Just one quick question from Nadia Fernandez. I don't know if it's quick, but they say, I would like to ask to the last panelist, I guess Megan, some thoughts on the connections between academic writing and creativity.
Yeah, well, that's one of my favorite things to talk about. And if you don't mind too, I've looked at some of the questions. I think I would also draw in sort of the question of material support, which has come up a few different times. And this is also where I want to really make clear that when I'm talking about these things, I'm doing so as a tenured faculty member. And I think this makes such an enormous difference. So in answer to the questions that arose about, well, like the NSF doesn't necessarily fund my performance art, so what should I do? How do you make space for this kind of work? I mean, one thing I would say is that I think tenure is such an incredible privilege that the only way we begin to become even remotely adequate to it is if we do take on responsibilities of administrative activism in the organizations where we are. So grants are given by committees of people that are us and are me and you and or will be you someday. And so these are things that we can influence and that we can change, that I certainly am trying to change in my own university, in my own department, in the culture here. I think it's also, someone had said, well, we're a social science. It's also, I think, okay for us to say, you know, I'm an anthropologist who's more like an artist. I don't actually think we need to be beholden to these categories that frankly never love us back. They have a lot of money behind them. They have a lot of power. But like I said, I think we can question them and we can remake them. And so one answer to this question is you know, this material question. You know, how do we think about creativity? Well, I think those of us who are in positions of structural power need to be having very serious conversations about making space for this. But then the other half of this is that, you know, I've never gotten very far with my work when I worry too much about being an anthropologist or a social scientist. And I'll just use an example from writing my first book. So, I had a pretty conventional trajectory, doing field work and writing a dissertation that I hated, and then going back and doing more research and having this data. And it was time to be writing it up. And I was just struggling. I felt like I couldn't make any form or sense or shape of the work. And one day I just had this epiphany that said, what if you just put everything else away and started writing this as a writer? You've always fancied yourself some kind of writer. So stop worrying about being an anthropologist and just be a writer and tell the damn story. And in fact, that's the only way I get any of my work out anymore, is if that is the primary identification, is with that creative moment, that spark of just tell the damn story. And whatever tools you need, you might even have to recultivate. One of the things I've done in the last 5 years is basically go back to writing school. I am in creative writing workshops with non-academic writers who keep me really honest, right? Who are like, what is this sentence? It's 11 lines long. Are you insane? You know, and cultivate craft with people outside my field, so that then I might have a bigger toolkit to bring to whatever that story is that needs to be told. So for me, it's not, it's something that happens. It's like a switch that I flip, that enables me to find the spark. It's the spark, right? If we can't find the tiniest bit of joy in what we're doing, I think it's going to feel bad all the way down. And when I say joy, I don't mean happiness. I mean what Audre Lorde called the erotic. I mean the spark that helps you go on, right? Which is a little bit different than feeling happy. But I do think we need joy.
Great. Thank you. Maybe then on that uplifting note, we will break. Sorry, I cut into the break. We'll break for 10 minutes and hopefully we'll see most of you back for panel 2. Thank you.